Hello and welcome, shareholders, investors, and traders. We've recently seen a lot of action with UAV Corp's stock price, ticker UMAV, and I wanted to provide a recap of what we know about the company's financial situation so far and outline reasonable expectations for the company moving forward. In case you are new to UAV Corp and haven't seen my previous videos, I highly recommend you watch them in order to get a background on the company. There's a lot of risk involved with the company, so it is important to understand both the bull and the bear cases associated with any possible investment. I know the first video I put out on the company was over an hour, but it provides a baseline understanding for UAV Corp's history. After all, if you're going to put money into a stock, you must research the company beforehand, otherwise you're gambling without knowing the odds. Of course, I encourage all of you to perform your own research and due diligence, because there's a good chance that I've missed something. If you find new information and want to correct me or discuss other perspectives, please bring them up. I welcome them. The more discussions we have, the better the UMAV community becomes. With that said, let's recap on what we know about UAV Corp. First off, the company carries legacy debt from their Hong Kong Technologies era. That company went through several iterations of previous companies since 1995 and failed to find a business concept that worked. They eventually decided to purchase a company called R2 Technologies and essentially do a reverse merger where Hong Kong Technologies took on the newly acquired company as its mission focus. In doing so, Hong Kong Technologies changed their name to UAV Corp in order to establish their identity in the drone sector. R2 Technologies became a wholly owned subsidiary as well as Skyborne Technology, which belonged to R2 Technologies before the acquisition. We also saw back in January that UMAV's share price tanked because debt holders saw the stock price skyrocket and they wanted to cash out through share conversions. Many of these share conversions were issued at a par value of $0.0001. Yes, that is 1/100th of a penny. By selling millions of shares for multiple pennies in a transaction, debt holders saw a massive profit, but their actions killed the stock's momentum and tanked the share price. This convertible debt diluted the share structure, and shareholders have continued to see dilution since then. In July, UAV Corp announced that they were making progress in eliminating convertible shares and reducing as much company debt as possible. From a financial standpoint, that strategy makes complete sense. Otherwise, you would see convertible debt destroying any future run to the stock price, like what we saw in January. However, the strategy in practice has brought a lot of pain for shareholders, because it has resulted in diluting shareholders now rather than later in the future. Mix in delays to milestone tests and not properly communicating updates to shareholders, then you can start to understand why veteran shareholders have become so pessimistic. The big pain point for shareholders is that we saw the authorized share cap reduced from 2 billion to 500 million in January. However, the authorized shares was later increased to 1 billion in July and then increased back to 2 billion in September. The company's original goal with the authorized share cap reduction was to provide shareholder value. Seeing UAV Corp revert back to the original authorized share cap has certainly left shareholders frustrated, even if the reason for increasing the cap has been for legal agreements with large senior debt holders. Another big problem with all this dilution is that shareholders have not been told how much dilution to expect, or how much of those large senior debt holders have left to be paid. Yes, we could look at quarterly reports, but those don't detail specifics on what sort of deals were negotiated between debt holders in exchange for eliminating convertible shares. If you take a look at UAV Corp's financial disclosures on OTC markets, you'll notice several supplemental information filings published since August 12, 2025. Most of these disclosed filings were for shares issued to Matterhorn partners. On July 22nd, Matterhorn received about 27 million shares, and another 34 million on August 19th, and another 38 million on August 29th. Note that the listed cost basis here seems to be a typo. For the sake of argument, I'm going to assume the cost per share was at the typical par value of 0.0001, to be consistent with what Matterhorn received previously. That would mean the cost basis was actually $3,831. This one issued about 69 million shares to Machiavelli Limited, LLC on August 21st. and Matterhorn got 40 million more shares on September 17th, and another 60 million on September 25th, and another 100 million on October 7th. Note that this filing was disclosed just after Joe visited UAV Corp. And finally, Matterhorn got about another 90 million shares on November 4th. Note that this filing was disclosed just after UMAV's recent Halloween run. Also note that this filing appears to have a typo with the cost basis, which I'm assuming is for $8,993.98 to keep up with their usual par value. So, if we add up all the issued shares from July 22nd to November 4th, we get the following table. Keep in mind this accounts for the adjustments we assumed for suspected cost basis typos. If you recall, the price per share on July 22nd was about 0.0027, then bottomed out to 0.0003 on October 23rd, then climbed as high as 0.0066 on November 5th. From these ranges, you can see that dumping shares at the current market price provided quite a nice profit for these debt holders. As we just saw, Matterhorn received a significant amount of shares. So the question becomes, who are they and what service are they providing? Using UAV Corp's Q2 report as its basis, shares are issued to individuals for a variety of purposes such as debt conversion, services, and officer compensation. However, Matterhorn wasn't listed in the Q2 report. So why would they eventually receive more common shares than the entire outstanding share balance as of August 11th, 2025? If you throw Matterhorn's address into Google Maps, you'll get a bunch of different businesses at that address. The confusing thing is that Matterhorn doesn't show up in those results. It turns out that the Glen Allen, Virginia address is a virtual address registered by V Corp Agent Services and is used for several different companies, including Matterhorn. A huge thanks to Musical Shares over on Investors Hub for putting the pieces together. While we don't see Matterhorn Partners listed in UAV Corp's Q2 report, we do see Trillium Partners, who is a debt holder. And wouldn't you know it, Matterhorn has a history of buying debt from Trillium Partners. On December 18th, 2024, a deal was made to transfer Trillium Partners' entitled shares of Bantech over to Matterhorn Partners. This is likely the same sort of situation we're seeing played out with the UAV Corp instead of Bantech. If you look more into this agreement, you'll notice that there is an anti-dilution provision to provide additional shares to the owed party in the event of dilution. While we don't have confirmed details from UAV Corp, a similar agreement was likely decided between UAV Corp, Matterhorn Partners, and one or more debt holders. If there was an anti-dilution provision granted to Matterhorn, then that would explain why they received significantly more shares after each authorized share increase. The frustrating thing, though, is that while Matterhorn was protected against dilution, retail shareholders were not. Additionally, shareholders were not warned of future authorized share increases until the share structure changed on OTC markets. UAV Corp would then post on X the next day that they raised the authorized share cap in response to legal obligations to senior debt holders. Recall that UAV Corp's July 24th press release mentioned active negotiations of eliminating convertible promissory notes. Matterhorn probably entered the picture at this point so that all involved parties agreed to eliminate convertible shares and provide a path forward for resolving outstanding debt. Unfortunately, it does not seem as though that whatever agreement was decided upon was publicly disclosed. So, UAV Corp shareholders do not know the terms and conditions agreed upon. This means that we do not know how much future dilution remains for the Matterhorn deal. It would be great if UAV Corp was transparent about the settled upon deal, and we may be able to get a glimpse of what was decided in their upcoming Q3 quarterly report. Fingers crossed. Alright, so that was a lot, but I hope it provides you with some context as to the dilution we've seen this year, and why UAV Corp is so focused on eliminating convertible debt. Now, unfortunately, shareholders who've been around this year have been the ones getting hit the most and have been footing the bill in terms of dilution. After all, we're the ones buying the shares that debt holders keep on dumping on the market. With that financial understanding out of the way, let's shift gears and take a look at what happened during a recent Halloween run. Leading up to the Halloween run, UMAV was stuck in the triple zeros with an intraday low of 0.0003. We saw a bit of price action on October 30th, but it was nothing like the upward movement on the 31st. The last time the stock was in the 0.002 range was back in July, and that was when the authorized share cap was at 1 billion. This made a lot of the shareholders wonder what caused the rise. After all, UAV Corp didn't post anything on X or release any PRs, and the last update we got from them was on October 21st. Even though no one knew why the stock went up, we were all pretty happy that we finally saw some upwards movement. Plenty of shareholders had their theories on why the stock rose on no news. I also had a few ideas too, those being 1. UAV Corp could be buying back shares, but the problem was they never announced that they received funding from the $50 million term sheet. Possibility 2. Information was leaked, and a well-funded party decided to buy up shares before the news was officially released. And possibility 3. A big pump and dumper was buying shares before telling other followers, with the intent of dumping their shares as soon as people joined in. Of course, there's plenty of other possibilities for why the stock rose without any news, but those are just some ideas. Overall, shareholders tended to believe that share buybacks was the cause. After all, it would make sense for the company to buy back shares when they're cheap. If so, UAV Corp could, keyword could, buy back enough shares to reduce the outstanding share count and maybe reduce the authorized shares back down. Even if reducing the authorized shares wasn't the strategy, this would at least make it harder for shareholders with large positions to dump everything they had all at once and take the price. Kind of like what happened in January when new shares were issued. This buyback strategy would also increase buying pressure and help get the share price closer to 1 penny, the minimum bid price for OTCQB, which is a near-term goal for the company. However, we didn't receive official confirmation from UAV Corp on whether or not they were buying back shares. Yes, they stated on X that their goal was to do so on September 18th, and they were looking into getting a company brokerage account. However, UAV Corp remained completely silent from October 31st up to and including November 5th. Sometimes, companies will announce their share buybacks ahead of time in order to provide as much transparency to shareholders as possible. Doing so provides the company a safe harbor as per SEC 10b-18, which reduces their liability for manipulating a stock price. If a company doesn't publicly announce their share buybacks beforehand, then they at least need to report the buybacks in their next quarterly report. That quarterly would have to list all the purchased shares on a daily basis. As you can imagine, a share buyback became the popular explanation among the UMAV shareholder community. Not only did it seem plausible, but it would indicate that shareholders would finally start seeing shareholder value. As the days went on, though, we started running into some indicators that a buyback may not have been the true reason. UAV Corp continued to remain silent on X, even when shareholders asked them what was going on. Cracks started to really show on November 3rd when OTC markets updated their share structure overnight. Specifically, the outstanding shares increased from 1.875 billion to 1.908 billion. Since I saw so many people continue to bring up share buybacks with a lot of confidence, I decided to put up a post on X and Reddit to counter the share buyback theory on November 5th. As you can imagine, I got some pushback on that post because it was not what anyone wanted to hear. And yeah, I get it. We finally got to see some bullish momentum in what seemed like a dead stock, so any bearish considerations was the last thing you wanted to hear. However, we were running on no news, and people kept on piling into the share buyback theory without any official evidence. So, it seemed like a reasonable counter to bring up. Unfortunately, we saw an even bigger counter that night when the outstanding shares increased again to 1.998 billion, pretty much maxing out the outstanding shares to the authorized share cap. And of course, this came in the form of newly issued shares to Matterhorn at what appears to be the 0.0001 par value. So yeah, definitely not what any one of us shareholders wanted to see, but that's just how dilution rolls. On November 6th, UAV Corp finally broke the silence, but it wasn't to say they were the ones buying back shares. Instead, they said that they were working on finalizing the $50 million term sheet, working on their Q3 report, acknowledged the recent share dilution, stated that the pilot's work visa was still in progress, and that they had an upcoming announcement the next week. Since UAV Corp does not have the $50 million term sheet yet, they don't have extra funds available to buy back shares, in my opinion. After all, if you look at the reported Q2 cash flow, you'll see that they are only able to pay for their operating activities by gathering cash from financing activities. This means that if they were to buy back shares, they would need to take on debt or receive cash advances to have the funds available to do so. In other words, they would need to dilute shareholders in order to have money to reduce dilution. That doesn't make sense to do now, when they need cash to pay off debt holders and to pay the costs for their upcoming test milestones. Now, once they have funds from the $50 million term sheet, then it would make sense to use some of those funds to buy back shares. However, they need the term sheet secured first. Now, of course, I could be wrong, but we need to understand the company's priorities with respect to their long-term goals. After all, share buybacks are usually what big companies do when they have so much extra money that they don't know what to do with. Instead of reinvesting the money back into the company, they opt for share buybacks to improve shareholder equity. So, if this wasn't a share buyback, which the jury is still out on, then why do we see so much volume? At this point in time, we don't know. However, one could imagine that if such high volume poured into buying a stock, for whatever reason, then that would gather quite a bit of attention, right? There are plenty of financial tools out there that scan for unusual activity, and such activity could encourage others to start piling into the stock and cause a snowball effect. Only time will tell if we find out what actually happened. Alright, so let's set some reasonable expectations as to what milestones we expect to see for positive fundamental developments with the company. First off, UAV Corp will need to secure financing for the $50 million term sheet. Once they have those funds, they will need to pay off their remaining debt. Now, it is possible that this next milestone can happen before the term sheet, especially since we don't know the term sheet's conditions yet, but UAV Corp will need to complete the overdue DART SA-70 weight balance analysis test. From their October 18th post on X, it sounds like they can complete this test without the foreign pilot. However, the foreign pilot's work visa will have to come next in the timeline because it blocks the next milestone, which is the DART SA-70 flight test. As what was relayed to Joe during his trip to UAV Corp, successful completion for the flight test will get the $525 million in LOIs converted to contracts. At that point in time, UAV Corp can then work towards fulfilling those contract orders for the DART MA 500 and 600 series of airships by first, building the Sky Hangar as an airship manufacturing facility. After all, these will be large airships, so they'll need a large hangar to house them. UAV Corp will then need to hire employees to build the airships because their current team is not large enough to do so. At that point, UAV Corp will be equipped to build and sell their airships to customers. And once they sell enough airships, UAV Corp will ideally become self-sustained going forward. When the dust settles from their costs, UAV Corp should have remaining funds to build additional orders for future customers, so they wouldn't need to rely on toxic debt like what they've been doing so far. Now, those events are a baseline for what I expect UAV Corp's timeline to look like, but there are some wildcard events that the company announced earlier that could be intermixed. We could hear news on the company qualifying for the remaining $1.5 billion of LOIs. At this point, we don't know what conditions UAV Corp must meet in order to qualify for the LOIs, but it is likely tied to some of the milestone tests, particularly the DART SA-70 flight test. It is also possible that there are other LOIs under negotiation, but UAV Corp only announced up to $1.5 billion in potential LOIs from their press releases earlier this year. We could also see UAV Corp buy back shares. It would make sense for them to do this once they have funds from the $50 million term sheet and are financially positioned to do so. A share buyback would play into their plans to uplist to OTCQB, which requires a minimum bid of 1 penny. If the share price isn't at that point, then UAV Corp may consider the share buyback to get there instead of doing a reverse split. Keep in mind that their eventual goal is to uplist to NASDAQ, but they'll need to meet further NASDAQ requirements before getting there. And finally, we could hear news of their payloads and sensor division. It is unclear as to how that will play out, but it could provide a competitive advantage for the company if they develop technology that sets them apart from the competition. At this point, we don't know of any specific technologies that would set them apart, but that tech could be under wraps until they're ready for production. Also keep in mind that UAV Corp mentioned they were building a new office in Auburn, Alabama to work with Dr. Roy Hartfield, their current Chief Technology Officer. Dr. Hartfield is a professor at Auburn University and has a pretty impressive resume, so it'll be interesting to see what he and UAV Corp could have in store. Now, it is important to consider some possible risks with the company's future based on behaviors we've seen from them this year. I mention these possibilities not to scare you, but to have a sense of the risks associated with the company. It is up to you to determine how comfortable you are in accepting these risks and any other ones related to the company. Now, because we don't know the deal UAV Corp made with Matterhorn and any of their remaining debt holders, we could continue to see share dilution. Given that we are near the 2 billion authorized share cap, UAV Corp may be required to increase the authorized shares again to satisfy legal obligations to debt holders. However, doing so will likely require converting their preferred shares to common shares. According to their April 2021 preliminary offering circular, although the company was given an authorized share cap of 2 billion for their common shares, there were equations listed for converting preferred shares to common shares. I have that offering circular linked in the description, so feel free to take a look at it for yourself. Keep in mind that increasing the authorized share cap would not require shareholder vote from retail investors because common shares do not hold voting powers. As we saw from earlier this year, UAV Corp announced the authorized share increase right after they did so. We could continue to see the government shutdown continue, which would delay the pilot's work visa and delay future milestone tests. Because UAV Corp is in the aerospace and drone industry, they are subject to the Federal Aviation Administration. We could also see this week's announcement be postponed. Now, I hope this is not the case because shareholders need to be updated, but I say this because we've unfortunately seen the company do this before. After all, we are still waiting on the postponed September 18th teleconference. We don't know what the announcement this week is going to be about, so there could be factors in play that would prevent the company from announcing it. With all those bullish and bearish considerations on the company's future, I want to leave you off with 2 more topics to consider, both of which we should see in the near term. First off is UAV Corp's Q3 quarterly report. Unfortunately, UAV Corp wasn't able to release their draft on Friday, so I wasn't able to mention it in this video. However, I at least wanted to give you some things to look out for when it does come out. First, check to see whether or not UAV Corp reported any share buybacks. Although I am skeptical that would be the case, it's still a possibility. Next, take a look at the share issuance history. In particular, look at the changes to the number of outstanding shares and the convertible debt sections. As with any quarterly report, you should take a look at the company's consolidated statements of operations, stockholders' equity, cash flows, and balance sheet. Keep in mind that UAV Corp's current financial position is entirely reliant on financing activities, so these financials are going to look pretty bad. Also, pay attention to the company's remaining debt. UAV Corp said that they were making progress on eliminating debt, so that section should reveal how much progress has been made and how much is left. These next few items to look out for might not be listed in the quarterly report because progress has not been made yet, but it would still be nice to see if there's anything. Those being any mention of their newly announced sensor division subsidiary, their planned Sky hangar, and any new officers joining the team. We'd probably hear more information about those details before they're listed in the quarterly report, but it doesn't hurt to keep an eye out for them. Now, keep in mind that if UAV Corp stays true to their announcement and releases an early draft, it is possible that minor details can change. By this, I mean slight modifications to numbers or details in a section, rather than big company developments. The final thing I want to leave you off with is my personal speculation as to what will be announced this week. Could it be that the company secured funding from the $50 million term sheet? Maybe, but their post on Friday makes it sound like there are several steps involved with finalizing the loan, and we don't know for sure how many steps are involved. It's still a possibility, though. Could it be an announcement on the weight balance analysis? In my opinion, I think this is the most likely option because UAV Corp's October 18th post stated that they plan on proceeding with the test without the pilot, and that they would reveal the dates once finalized. Given that we haven't heard any news about the test since then, I think it is about time for some news. Of course, there could be something else entirely, but it's hard to tell on not knowing. Regardless of what the announcement is, I hope they reveal some positive fundamental developments for the company. And that's all I have for you. Thanks for watching, and I encourage all of you to continue your research into the company. I want all shareholders to be well equipped with knowledge and freely sharing their thoughts with the rest of the community. After all, the more shareholders are founded in fact, then the better we are as a whole. Anyways, hopefully we hear some good news, and have a good one.